You and Tim Wu seem to have you seem to have a little bit of or a lot of disagreement with the entire antitrust approach from the Biden era, from the Biden administration era. Are there simplistic rules we can follow? Does each case have to be looked at on a case by case basis, or are there simple rules that we can follow? I.e., the consumer welfare standard should predominate. Something else should predominate. Are there any basics that we can go by to say this is when competition is working and this is when it isn't?
To say something nice about the sort of Biden antitrust move, I think a totally valid point that Lina Khan made and brought forward was that the conduct remedies that the Justice Department had been, there was this view that we should do the minimal intervention. If there is a competition problem, we will get Comcast to promise not to preference its own channels, things like that. And I think they brought a very strong argument that this is really hard to make work, that there's a lot of regulatory capture, and that if the merger is problematic, you should just not allow it. I think the original enthusiasm that a lot of people had to say we need to take a harder look at the role that these large technology companies are playing in our society has a lot behind it and explains a lot of the political juice. I do question the view that antitrust is the right lens to look at something like that. I'm a parent. Most parents who I know have a lot of questions about, our kids and their screen time and short form videos and, what they're doing there, how that's changing things. The presence of TikTok as a new competitor to YouTube and Facebook, that doesn't give me a lot of peace of mind about this, because the worry isn't that, the market isn't competitive enough and we're not delivering enough short form brain rot videos to children. It's that the product is bad, right? It would be like sitting around in 1990 and saying the cigarette industry is too consolidated, when that's just not the issue. So, I don't want to have us thinking of this as the only sort of tool that we can lever. I think in some ways that recapitulates the mistake of overly economicsifying everything in society, right? These companies just have a lot of influence over our lives and over the way that things work. A related issue, though, with the platforms was, so there's this issue in New York City where they've essentially banned the construction of new hotels, and they've also banned Airbnb. And so, the hotel owners and the hotel workers union sort of got together and they put these rules in place. Somebody on Twitter was like, how did hotels get so expensive? Somebody else was explaining what happened here. And then Max Miller, who was an advisor to Alvaro Bedoya on the Federal Trade Commission, he says no. The real issue here is that the hotels are engaged in algorithmic price fixing. And so we need an antitrust solution. I don't know about this algorithmic price fixing of hotels, yes or no. The fact of the matter is, they've created an artificial scarcity of hotel rooms in New York as a deliberate matter of public policy. That's really bad. That's bad rent seeking. People who care about competition and competitive markets should be trying to make markets more competitive, not just kind of obsessively focused on the idea that technology is bad. This just happens to be a very old-fashioned industry, like hotel owning, that has set itself up with a little regulatory cartel for no particularly good reason. It's, classic concentrated cost, diffuse benefits, or the other way around. I forget what I'm saying. These are big problems in our society. And a lot of anti-competitive rulemaking, in effect, is sheltering smaller players from competition. That's a sort of a very common mode of rent-seeking politics. And we need to be symmetrically watchful of these different kinds of problems.
So I agree 100% with you about the hotel and Airbnb. But going back to your example of cigarette producers, I think that's an interesting example because there is no doubt that cigarette kills you. And there is, in my view, no doubt that having that industry more concentrated is more problematic because it makes it more politically powerful. After all, the reason why we had so much advertising and sponsoring of art by Philip Morris is because they want to distract us with art from the fact that they kill people. And the fact that they were able to place, that Justice Powell was a board member of Philip Morris. And when he went to the Supreme Court, he had a robe with the symbol of Philip Morris embroidered in his robe. So the fact that Philip Morris was able to place a very important figure while Lewis Powell on the Supreme Court is because it was very powerful and consolidated. Versus, for example, the wine sector that is much more fragmented. It's not that alcohol is very good for you either, but I think that the wine industry, the liquor is different, but the wine industry is so fragmented that they don't really have a lot of political power. But the beer industry, the liquor industry, and the cigarette industry are very politically powerful because they are concentrated. So I think that the issue of power is relevant.
Well, I mean, the issue of power is definitely relevant. But I don't think it's obvious that a more concentrated industry is going to be more politically powerful, right? So, for example, beer is taxed at a higher rate than wine in the United States, even though it's a more concentrated industry. That could just be a coincidence. It could be many, many things. But often it's dispersed industries have a lot of power in Congress because, for example, car dealerships, right? There's like an owner in everybody's district. And so they come and do it versus a big industry is concentrated in one or two places and it can be more vulnerable to regulation. And I think, you see in Europe, a lot of instances of sort of small business coalitions exercising incredible amounts of political influence and sort of, protecting themselves from regulation through this kind of means. In general, we see a more favorable regulatory treatment of smaller employers rather than large ones. They'll say, oh, we can't comply with this parental leave regulation, which may be true. It's harder logistically when you're a small business, but you get a kind of a lighter touch. And you can create a lot of economic dysfunction by making it hard for people to get to big scale. Now, again, when it's a vice industry like tobacco, what is the outcome you actually want there is sort of an interesting question all to itself. But in general, I'm just not convinced that fragmentation reduces the political power of a given industry.
You wrote this question: is antitrust a tool to protect consumers from higher prices or to defend small businesses against big ones? Is there an answer to that? Or is there, if you had to summarize in one sentence, two sentences, what should the goal of antitrust be? Why does it exist at all?
I think that protecting consumers is a good value. I think if you want to say, we also want to protect workers, that sort of makes sense to say that the consumer focus is maybe too narrow. But I don't like the view of antitrust as a tool to protect small businesses against competition from sort of bigger corporate entities. I mean, I run a small business myself, a subscription newsletter. I think it would be great if somehow you could stop the New York Times or CNN or large scale enterprises from plowing me under in the name of preserving a lack of competition. But I don't think that that's really a sound model. And I think a lot of the productivity advantage that the United States has achieved vis-a-vis Europe over the years comes from the fact that we are friendlier to scale and that we actually have less of these kind of informally operated family businesses where, you're handing the reins over to your nephew and things like that. And we have more professionalized management. I think Luigi's written on this. Yeah. I mean, this is part of your diagnosis of the Italian economy, right? Is that it's this kind of excessively fragmented, family-oriented firms. So, if I look at the United States as a whole, we have some big problems as a country. Our life expectancy is lagging quite a bit from what you would like to see from a developed country. I'm really interested in ideas about things like that. But in the pure economic terms, right, our GDP growth has been really quite good. So I would be just have some baseline skepticism about the idea that we need a big change to the economic regulation model, as opposed to saying we have a very high child poverty rate and we'd maybe need to give parents more money, or we have all these people dying in car crashes and we need to make our roads safer. Those seem like the big problems to me. Whereas some of this antitrust stuff, particularly the small business protectionism, seems to me like trying to replicate the less successful aspects of a Western European social model.